All right. We are officially live. I want to welcome everyone to Reforming the System. Just want to make sure we're all good here before we officially start the program. This is exciting stuff. So I just while we're waiting here, I just want to thank Chesa for the 3 a.m. text that you responded to. There's a lot of stuff happening on social media, as we all know, and I wanted to really just provide this space for you all to, just have the conversation. This is a crazy time that we live in, and really appreciate you all taking the time to chat with Black Citizen. Let's just get started. I mean, I like the flow of things. People are flowing in. D.A. Rollins, hello.
Hi, guys.
Welcome. We're just letting folks sort of trickle into the live stream. While we're in a holding sort of pattern, I would encourage everyone to, if you're not doing this already, follow us on social media, all of the platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Black Citizen CA is our handle. My name is Theo Ellington. I'm one of the founders for Black Citizen. I have my colleague Obai Rambo with us. I have Ayana Moody, who's also here with us. And I want to give a special shout out to Sarah Baker Richardson, who is not able to join us. Her kid had an accident, and we hope Taj is recovering well. But I think we've got a good sort of group of folks joining in. So I think we're going to just go ahead and get started here. I want to officially welcome folks. Again, my name is Theo Ellington. I'm one of the founders of Black Citizen. And we're in for a real treat today. Folks are watching us from our Black Citizen Facebook page, but also watching us from the Bayview Opera House in San Francisco and the FAM Foundation in Philadelphia. So I want to welcome folks officially and tell you a little bit about Black Citizen and who we are, what we do. We are a social impact initiative really aimed at changing the way that we respond to Black issues facing our community. And you can think of us almost like an incubator. We provide micro grants to emerging organizers, and we couple those grants with executive leadership coaching. We think we build sustainable movements when we connect people to networks, when we connect people with money, and we give them the skills they need to be successful. So we've been at this for about 2 months now, and this is a larger part of a speaker series that we'll be rolling out over the next couple months. But I wanted to be a little intentional today before I hand it over to Celeste and company, just about why we called this. There's been a lot of noise on the internet. There's been a lot of noise on social media. And we're hoping today that we build this space intentionally. And what I mean by that is, number one, I want for the next hour for everyone to block out all of this outside craziness that's happening and really fully understand and acknowledge that the criminal justice system has failed so many Black folks, so many families, and really decimated our society. And today we really have an opportunity to dig deep and have a substantive discussion around what this window of opportunity means as we look to dramatically transform this unjust system. I'm going to leave you with a quote before I introduce Celeste, and I have this hanging on my wall. And it reads, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And I think it's very appropriate and very fitting for just the time we live in today. Given all the things happening in 2021, it's time to turn a new leaf and really transform a system that's been so unjust for so many. Celeste.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to moderating this conversation today. I'm going to introduce quickly the DAs who probably don't need any introduction and quickly introduce what FAM has been doing. FAM has been around for 30 years this year, working on really trying to attack excessive sentencing, trying to find relief for people who are serving unjust and excessive sentences. And so it has been a real pleasure to serve along the FAM Foundation team. And so please follow all of FAM's social media, FAM Foundation on Twitter. There's also some FAM Facebook pages. We also have a great Instagram. So please reach out and follow everything that FAM is doing. You can also text FAM, F-A-M-M, to 21333, and you can get involved that way and advocate straight from your phone. So I want to real quickly introduce today, Chesa Boudin. Thank you so much for coming. You are the DA of San Francisco, obviously. We've got Larry Krasner, the DA from Philadelphia, and Rachel Rollins, the DA from Suffolk County, Massachusetts. I want to just really quickly dive into the conversation because I know there's so much to talk about. I know here we're really highlighting Black issues and how we can really do that work that is so important to transform the systems that impact our Black community. So I want to start with DA Rollins. You know, as the first woman elected of DA of Suffolk County and the first woman of color to hold this position in Massachusetts, can you tell us a little bit about some of the ways that you yourself have, you know, experienced racial and gender bias in the system, you know, how those experiences have really helped inform your policies as DA?
Yes. So first, thank you for letting me speak with two of my dear friends, Chesa and Larry, and on this important topic. I have been very vocal and honest about the fact that I myself have a Corey. When I was 19, I was alleged to have committed a misdemeanor. When I was in college, I was a Division I athlete with a full scholarship who was on honor roll at school, and I got a continued without a finding. And now as the chief law enforcement officer, I know, I remember being in court with many other people who either were in college or weren't in college that didn't look like me, and they were null prossed, or you know, the case did not move forward. I now know that people of color are often, even when it is a disposition that ultimately might result in a dismissal, it is a stain and a brand in that it is still on my criminal record, in my criminal history. So as a 19-year-old, I experienced that. As the oldest of 5 children, I have siblings that have cycled in and out of the criminal legal system. I, as the sibling of them, have made calls to our court-appointed counsel. Some of them were some of the best lawyers I've ever seen in my life. Others weren't, right? In every profession, there are exceptional and there are not exceptional people, but just feeling the sense of shame and desperation, calling and trying to get help from a system that wasn't responsive in some circumstances. And then as a federal prosecutor myself, I worked in the United States Attorney's Office. This is how I have looked my whole life. I was an assistant United States attorney. At least 2 to 3 times a month, when I would run down to court for one of my hearings, or to start a trial or to do something in one of the federal courtrooms, I would open the door and someone would be opening the second door and say, "There you are, you're late." And I would say, "I'm sorry, do I know you?" And they'd say, "You're the interpreter, right?" Or when I tried to walk and push the swinging, gate open with my Redwell in a suit, ready to represent the United States of America, a U.S. Marshal would jump up and say, "The family sits over there." So there is a system that is not used to seeing people that look like me leading, right? And we are shattering that system as we speak. And we have people that are allies in the sense that we have 2 exceptional criminal defense lawyers who you're about to hear from right now, who are now the chief prosecutors in that office. But I have a lived experience here that I still feel that to this day.
Thank you so much for sharing your personal experience. And I think it's so right about highlighting, how we can kind of change what people think about who are leading these movements here. And I want to move on to Chesa here. I know your personal experience. I know you're very open about it. Your recent, I believe it was a Medium post, I think was beautiful about your personal experience. So what was it about your personal experience that made you decide to then become the district attorney of San Francisco?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I wrote the article not on Medium, but in The Nation magazine, the one that you're referring to most recently, which kind of traces some of my own childhood experience grappling with my parents' incarceration from the time I was a baby, and the impact that their decision to participate in a really serious crime where 3 people were killed had on me and on our relationship. And it recognizes through my own experience and the many people I got to know in the lines to get into prison visiting rooms over the years, other people who were incarcerated alongside my parents, of course, most of whom were Black and brown, that when we make the decision to incarcerate, when we make the decision to convict someone of a crime, there are ripple effects, there are collateral consequences. And we need to be intentional and mindful of the consequences of these kinds of decisions. It means, in my view, that incarceration should exist not as a primary response to the wide array of social problems that have been dumped on criminal courts, but rather as a last resort, only when drug treatment and mental health services and diversion programs are unable to address root causes of crime. It's a lesson in the complexity of humanity and the need for more humane, more cost-effective, and ultimately better ways to keep our communities safe.
Thank you so much. And Larry, I just want to move on to you about your experience. I mean, a lot of Philadelphia kind of knows that you are coming from the opposite side usually, right? You've been suing, trying to root out corruption in Philadelphia for so many years, leading up to your decision to run for district attorney here in Philadelphia. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about your decision to, not switch sides, because I think it's the same goal, right? It should be justice, whether you're on the defense or working for prosecution. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your experience. I think you're muted. Still, Yep. All right. So I'm going to come back to Larry with that question. So I want to talk a little bit about, charging decisions, right? And kind of what prosecution and a district attorney, prosecutors have that power in charging decisions, and historically what that has done to Black people, Black communities. So I'd love to start with DA Rollins and hear your your ideas about charging and your policies and how that has impacted Black communities in your area.
Yeah, I mean, they are some of the biggest decisions that we make, right? And so it depends, and it is pretty arbitrary at times regarding what we are going to charge. And just because we can charge something doesn't mean we must, right? What is the just outcome? We have a Chief Justice of our state Supreme Court who unfortunately died unexpectedly. He just had a study commission from Harvard and looking at all of the disparities in the system, and Black and brown individuals, BIPOC community, is often overcharged for same exact crimes as their white counterparts. So for me, I am very deliberate about what it is we are charging people with and why. And so one of the things I tried to do as a district attorney or as a candidate was there was an entire level of or 15 types of crimes where we were going to switch the presumption. These are the low-level, nonviolent, non-serious crimes that in Suffolk County, at least, are the ones that have people churning through a system where very often it is, it is the underlying, substance use disorder, mental health issue, food or housing insecurity, or some other crisis they find themselves in, which is a societal failure that results in me being the catch basin at the end of the system in the criminal legal system. So we said, rather than prosecuting all of those, which is what my predecessors did, let's flip this presumption and think about null processing or diverting completely pre-trial or pre-arraignment even, right, before they're branded with a record. But we work really hard to make sure our charging decisions are informed and that we are collecting data to see whether there are disparities with respect to people's demographics with what we do.
That's fantastic. And I think Larry might be unmuted now. So I'm going to go back to him and actually ask a second follow-up question. And hopefully you can answer both, just about a little bit about your experience and why you decided to run for DA. But also I wanted to talk about your data collection. I know your office has really focused a lot on data collection and outcomes of some of the policies that you have instituted. And I'd love to hear about, you know, some positive outcomes that have been on Black Philadelphians. Oh, we still can't hear you. We could hear you earlier. Hopefully somebody can figure out on Larry's end why we're unable to hear him. But I think I wanted to, in the meantime, go back to something that I think is really important, is that, you know, usually people have a carceral response to things, right? And we need to reimagine that. Do we need to have incarceration as the primary response to harm being caused or different behaviors? And so I want to just quickly go back to DA Rollins, something that you said in your policy memo. And I think this is something that if more people understood and really took to heart about the criminal justice system or the criminal legal system, people would kind of understand a little bit more where a lot of the, you know, reform end is coming from. You say, I don't believe accountability has to equal incarceration. There are many ways that we can hold people accountable without putting them in jail. So I'd love to hear from everybody on the call, what ways your offices have kind of prioritized accountability methods outside of incarceration. I know we've talked about charging decisions, but I'd love to hear from DA Rollins, hopefully DA Krasner, but also DA Boudin about you know, how the outcomes of those policy changes have made an impact on Black communities.
Right. So listen, resources reduce harm, full stop. Right. And not resources, more resources into Larry and Chesa in my office. I'm talking about investing in people, right? I'm talking about, you know, the best deterrent to crime is or let's go back to when we were younger, and I'm 50 now. So I'm old enough to be Chase's mom and, like, you know, maybe Larry's niece or something, right? But you know, what I can tell you is when I think about my childhood and when people say, what made you feel safe? My answer wasn't the police. It was my parents, right? My friends, you know, my house, my room, like whatever it was about those fundamental things that we had that protected us. And it wasn't a gun or a police officer or department, right? So for me, I feel like you know, in Boston, we have segregated public school systems. We have failing school systems. The COVID-19 global pandemic has, you know, exposed significant disparities in certain communities based on, you know, accessibility. And I'm hearing some feedback, so I don't know if that's coming from me. But I feel like the resources I want to put into are, you know, education and after school programs and legitimate things that young people can experience, rather than feeling as if there's nothing else they can do, but possibly be sucked up in activity that they have no other alternative to engage in. So we have lots of our juvenile diversion, our JAR program. We have been really deliberate about where we're putting money to make sure that when I say, nope, I'm snatching these individuals and null processing their case, or pre-arraignment, making sure they do something, can I actually send them to a place that is legitimate and has a credibility, and has proven that they can do the work necessary to help people? They aren't just taking people's mass health card and making money off of people's pain, but they aren't getting better, right? We have a lot of situations where we have been very deliberate about making sure that the entities that are helping are actually doing that. But I know Larry and Chase are doing a lot of great things as well.
All right, let's try Larry again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
All right. You know, I was actually going to fake it. I was just going to move my mouth and not say anything.
Welcome back.
Juvenile. So anyway, well, thank you for having me back. So I think you asked me why I ran for DA, but I also think your suggested answer was a good one, which is that I don't view these things as being opposite. I think a traditional prosecutor is opposite reform and it's opposite fairness that a defense attorney is asking for. But I think, a progressive prosecutor is not. We are in many ways complementary. One of the reasons I became a civil rights attorney and I started suing police officers for corruption, brutality, racism, framing people is there was no prosecution of them going on. We had traditional prosecutors who never held them accountable at all. So in a sense, I was one of that little band, those few people in the city of Philadelphia who were prosecuting them. We just had to do it in civil court because nobody was going to give us a hammer. We were just going to have to use Nerf balls. So that is what we did. And I see it as being the same intent. It's an attempt to have some kind of even-handed equal justice. It's an attempt to make sure that power is exercised with restraint.
I love that answer, so thank you. But I think while you were hopping off, we were talking a little bit about data and how policies and data-driven policies and outcomes are really, really important in this movement to kind of show that, yes, things, can work, right? So I'd love to hear a little bit more from you and Chesa about, how your offices have been collecting data and how you've been able to see some positive outcomes for specifically Black citizens in your communities based on some of the policy changes that you've instituted.
So let me give you a quick answer just because I was shut down there for a minute. There was no data lab in this office when we came in. There was no criminologist. We hired a criminologist and we were blessed by getting significant grant money coming out of Silicon Valley, basically, for the purpose of trying to measure some of our policies, whether they worked or not, some longer term projects they have, including racial equity projects. We are now at essentially 15 data analysts. And even though we don't have the largest data lab of the DA's offices in the United States, we do have one of the most outward facing. We have a public dashboard where people can look to see whether when we say we're going to try to do something about mass incarceration, we really are reducing the future years of incarceration or not. You cannot fix what you do not measure. Yes, it is an old slogan, but it's really true. If you want to talk about racially disparate treatment, measure it, and then see if your policies can address it, whether they can improve it, whether we can make it better. Those are the kinds of things that we're trying to do. Obviously, it's a big project, but that's what we're trying to do.
Thanks. And then Chesa, how about you in San Francisco? Have you seen any, data-informed outcomes or anything that are really, showing that we can reduce future years of incarceration, future years of community supervision, but also do things to restore, years of life back into our Black communities?
Absolutely. As DA Krasner said, you've got to measure it first. And we're all dealing with court systems and filing systems and interfaces with police and probation that make it really, really challenging to measure a lot of the data that we know we need to be able to measure. So it's a huge lift just to get those systems up and running. We're working on that. In the meantime, we're absolutely measuring everything we can and being transparent about it. Let me give you a couple of statistics from San Francisco. And mind you, I've only been in office for about 15 months. We've reduced the number of people in California State Prison out of San Francisco County by about a third since I took office. We've also reduced the number of people in San Francisco County Jail by about 40% since I took office. And about 50% of the people in the jail were African American compared to only 3 to 4% of the city's population that's Black. So the benefits are accruing primarily to communities of color, the ones that are over-incarcerated, over-policed. And in the meantime, overall crime, as reported by the police, has declined. In other words, there are those folks who tell you, well, based on fear, that if we let people out of jail, if we decarcerate, if we rely on diversion programs, or other approaches to accountability that are not simply more punishment, that crime will go up. And we've seen the opposite in San Francisco. We've seen overall crime decline by more than 25%, including really serious categories of crime. Rape down by about 50%, robbery down by about 25%, assault down by about 15% since I took office. So we know that some of those trends are driven by the pandemic. And we also know that we've been able to safely decarcerate. And it's been a critical part of preventing a significant outbreak of COVID in our jails. And let me give you one other concrete example of a new initiative that I launched, which is really aimed at strengthening families, particularly the families that are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. And one of my first acts as district attorney in January of 2020 was to launch a primary caregiver diversion program, the first county in the state to implement the program that recognizes we are all safer when parents are at home taking care of their kids than when they're in cages. And the program identifies people charged with nonviolent crimes and felonies or misdemeanors, and it gives them a chance to engage with parenting classes and other programming. And sometimes it takes 2 years, but if they complete the programming, they can earn a dismissal. Now, despite the pandemic and all the challenges that presents for this kind of programming and for these individuals and their families, we've referred over 135 people in its first year to this program. More than 90% of them showed up. And of those who have completed the program, 90% were successful. Only one person was kicked out as unsuccessful and reverted back to traditional criminal courts. That's data, that's real lives. Those are kids who will grow up with their parents at home instead of visiting them behind bars the way that I did.
And that is such an important thing. And I think not enough people realize that, right? When people are sent through the criminal legal system, it's not just punishing that individual. We have to understand that families, children are being separated. And we have to, really try to reimagine what we're doing here, because obviously what we've been doing has not worked. And I want to pick up on something that you said in this last answer about how we have been able to safely and rapidly decarcerate. And I'd love to hear from each of you how you think that, obviously we've been able to decarcerate in a lot of different places because of COVID-19, and we've been able to do it safely. So how can lessons learned through COVID-19 and those responses really try to kind of shape the way that hopefully we can have other prosecutors reimagine how they do prosecution, and then also imagine how we do corrections in general? Let's start with DA Rollins.
So I no longer want people defaulted, right? Like there's no reason why why people have to physically come into court for certain essential parts of the process, right? We have all these times where we're demanding people every 4 to 6 weeks come back in, and depending on what judge you're in front of, and everyone has these, that at 9:01 everyone's defaulted, or the judge that strolls in at 10:30 themselves, right, after you've taken all this time to do this. So I think first and foremost, there are ways where we can adapt and make that change. I also think we need to really look at what type of cases we are prosecuting, right? Like, it was something I had thought about before the global pandemic, but like I said, the sort of list of 15 with limited resources, with, a smaller opportunity to make an impactful change. Am I going to be focused on 13 driving on a suspended license charges, or 13 rapes of a child, right? Like that's not even an option for me, but we put more time sometimes into these low-level, non-violent, non-serious crimes, where I'm not saying that they aren't important, but I am just saying, if you have to ask me where I want to spend my time, I want to spend it solving these homicides, getting these dangerous individuals out of the community and into programs that can ultimately help them if necessary. And then, well, I'll leave it there and see what else the others have to say.
Larry, you want to hop in?
Sure, I agree with all that. I think that's super helpful as always, Rachel. But I want to talk about something quite different, though, which is not just sort of the lesson of what happens when you have to get people out of jail because you don't want to have a super spreader situation. But I want to talk.
Oh, we lost you, Larry.
All right, we'll go with Chase. Larry back. Oh, wait. Are you back now? Try to say something real quick, Larry. Yeah. All right. We'll go to Chase real quick and see if we can get Larry back. I don't know why his audio keeps cutting out.
Well, I want to echo Rachel as well. The reality is that there are far more crimes on the books than our offices have. Well, let me just go further upstream. There are far more crimes on the books than any police department could ever investigate or arrest. There are far more crimes that result in arrests than our offices have the resources to prosecute. And then courts have the resources to handle. And then jails or prisons have the opportunity or the resources to jail. And so we need to make decisions at every step of the process. And one of the decisions that I know all three of us have made, and that I'm really was inspired by Rachel's example, by Larry's example, and that I've done my best to follow, in my own administration, is to say we should not be criminalizing poverty. We should be decriminalizing poverty. It is not a crime to be too poor to afford a bathroom. It is not a crime to be too poor to afford a roof over your head in an expensive city. And hand in hand with that recognition and that reality is a recognition that we also need to focus our resources, our limited resources, on the most serious and violent crimes, right? It's why cases like homicides or sexual assaults will always be my top priority. It's where we'll put our resources. It's where we'll have our most experienced attorneys. It's where we'll have our lowest caseloads. And hopefully it's where we'll use our courtrooms as well. Those are the cases that cause the most harm to victims and that have the highest consequences for the people we accuse of committing the crimes. We can build safety if we focus our resources on the things that cause the most harm. And we can undermine safety if we criminalize poverty the way that has been done for generations. You can trace it back as Michelle Alexander and Angela Davis and so many others have eloquently done in their academic work, all the way back to slavery and the efforts to continue to oppress and subjugate an entire people based on the color of their skin, how much money they had in the bank, or the fact that they were somehow different than the ruling class. We've got to change that, and we need to lead from our offices to undo the history of complicity that so many district attorneys' offices have played over the last several hundred years of American history. Larry, you're back, right?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
I want to be clear. Donald Trump is trying to jam my signal, and that's what and I'm proud of it. All right. So let me just say this. I agree with every bit of that. That all makes tremendous sense to me. But one of the things that we all need to guard against, and it's no joke, is that the surge in gun violence, which is happening all over the country, pretty much every major city, is going to be used as an excuse to reverse these kinds of anti-carceral reforms. And we need to have an answer for that. I think I do have an answer in Philly, and it's probably one you've already figured out. But here's the question. So what happens when all the recreation centers are closed, all the swimming pools are closed, every form of organized sports, PAL, school, Little League, every form of organized sports is closed. Summer camps are closed. What happens when high school classrooms are closed all over the city? What happens when job programs are closed? What happens when you can't even get a job in your neighborhood for the one-man contractor down the street who's got the rusty van and would hire you to load out broken plaster in a cardboard box while you sit on a milk crate? What happens when that's closed? What happens when people making less than $40,000 get absolutely slammed economically while we have more billionaires than ever? And the answer is this. The answer is that you have 40% increases in homicides by gun in major cities, that you have 40 or more % increases in shootings in major cities. Philly had a terrible year last year. We had a 40% increase in homicides. But just to put it in perspective, they looked at 34 major cities, and Philly was number 23 on the list, meaning number one was the worst. Philly's way down here. There were cities looking at 90, 110% increases. And this is all going on at the same time as we are seeing what Chesa referred to, which is declines in crime during the pandemic, and even declines in the category of violent crime, which includes things like rapes and robberies, but also includes gun violence. We have underestimated from the beginning how incredibly protective these kinds of things are for society, especially in relation to the behavior of young men who are the ones shooting each other and getting shot, at least in Philly, almost without exception. We have underestimated how important they are. The lesson coming out of this is not more jail cells. The lesson coming out of this is we need to double down on investing in things like this. And if we do that, we won't just come back to pre-pandemic levels. We'll come to the kind of reduced levels of gun violence that we've seen with similar efforts in Chicago and LA.
If I could jump on, and Larry, like, amen, right? Add to that, those children, many of those children, their parents are the first responders. We've always known that police are first responders and fire and EMS, but we now know it's also the people that work in hospitals, the people that work in supermarkets, right? The people that work in transportation, getting us to and from different places, that are putting their lives at risk to keep us alive during this global pandemic. All of them might have children that are now homeschooled. Many of them have children that are on IEPs or English language learners. All of those things, Larry, that you're talking about. Additionally, those parents are now under exceedingly higher amounts of stress based on higher rates of unemployment now, the fact that people are getting evicted or foreclosed upon, and there might not be any rent or mortgage protections, depending on where you are in the country. If it's an immigrant population, there's a fear of going to the government for help, for fear that you might be deported or somebody else. So those are exacerbating factors that above and beyond those young children, we've seen either some people have seen a spike in domestic violence or the numbers are significantly lower, but we know it's happening, as well as child abuse and neglect. So adding on to all of that, that is a recipe for crime, right? And all of those additional stressors, even one of them might be enough, but add them all together, and those are all the comorbidity factors that we are finding resulting in all of this increased violence.
I'm so glad you brought that up too, because that is the common discourse that we're seeing now, right? People are saying, "Oh, well, wait a minute, there's more shootings now. Maybe we shouldn't do this," or the prosecutors are not prosecuting gun violence, which is something that we often see, and obviously is not the case and not based in fact. But I think one thing that all of you keep hitting on that I think is so important is resources, right? What are we as people who live in these communities and pay taxes in these communities, what are we to expect, right? So what does public safety look for each different community? A lot of times it's not going to look like more incarceration. Sometimes it doesn't look like more police. And one thing I think is so fascinating is in Philadelphia, the focus on really talking about the cost of incarcerating an individual when you bring them into a courtroom. Not enough people, I think, realize that in Pennsylvania, it costs around $50,000 a year on average to incarcerate a person. And in our responses, legislatively, so often we see just immediately carceral responses, and everybody has hit on that so far. And that's not necessarily what communities need. We need to focus our resources elsewhere. And so I'd love to hear from each of you about, how you focus on the cost of incarceration in your decisions to prosecute in your offices, and what you would say to your communities who are saying, "Hey, you're not incarcerating enough people." What would you say to them about the resources that we are saving by not unnecessarily incarcerating as many people? Let's start with Chesa.
Thanks, Celeste. I don't want to steal Larry's thunder, but he's got an amazing policy on this, and so I'll let him speak to it. But I think it's one that really forces judges who are making sentencing decisions to grapple with those costs. Because one of the challenges historically is that the costs of incarceration are not borne by the district attorney's office. If we send someone to prison for life instead of for 10 years, if we send someone to prison instead of to a treatment program, those costs are external to our budgets and even to our local governments. But if we keep them in our jail, or if we put them on probation, or if we try to find them a mental health diversion program, those costs are borne locally. And so there's a real false, I think, incentive to push the problem out of our budget and onto the state prison budget in ways that has kind of created a vicious cycle where incarceration becomes the norm. The state invests in building more prisons, and local prosecutors can make these someone else's problems. We know that the costs are horrific. In California, the cost of incarceration is over $80,000 per person per year. If we would invest some of that money, or even some of the money that we're saving through decarceration policies in communities that need better access to education and healthcare and housing and jobs, we would be in the long term far safer. Our communities would be healthier. We would have fewer people getting victimized by crimes, and we could, instead of that vicious cycle I described, build a virtuous cycle where money saved from decreases in crime and incarceration goes back into communities in ways that helps heal those who are harmed by crime and also prevent the next crime from occurring.
I love that response. DA Krasner, you're back. Did you want to hop? Did you hear the question? I don't know when you hopped off.
I heard a lot of it. I don't know what's going on here. I still
that's
think
okay. We're still happy to have you.
Yeah. So, what I did hear is Chesa talking about reinvestment, which is so crucial, because if what we are going to do is we're going to decarcerate a lot of people, then take all the money and make $10,000 tax breaks for, well-heeled homeowners in major cities, pursuant to some misguided policy where big cities give all of their tax revenues away to big business and to prosperous homeowners, we're not going to get anywhere. If we're going to save millions and millions of dollars and we're going to invest it in things that prevent crime, that make communities whole, we're going to do much better. I also heard Rachel saying things that I thought were 100% on point about don't just look at the factors outside the home that are missing, the protective factors. Look at the harm that the pandemic has done within the home and to parents and their ability to address this kind of a crisis. I think she's absolutely right.
And I'll jump in and just say that, the way I try to talk about this is I presented in front of our legislature in Massachusetts for raising the amount of money that our legislature was going to give per student in our sort of rural and urban poorest schools in the Commonwealth. And they were literally talking about the difference between like $15,000 a student and $17,000 a student. And when I tell you it was the strongest cross-examination I've ever received in my life regarding that $2,000. And at one point I said, wait, I'm sorry. You know what I find really amazing is none of you bat an eye at the $55,000 it's going to cost for these students who are failed by our school system when we put them in our carceral facilities, that's how much it's going to cost then. Let's invest the money in hope and promise and opportunity now to the tune of 1/3 less, right? And remember, when we look at these numbers, guys, what is the ratio, Larry, in like public schools in Philadelphia, student per teacher, right? Is it 1 to 28, right? In Massachusetts, we are in the mid to high 20s of one teacher per 25, 28, maybe even 30 students in elementary school. Chesa, I don't know if it's the same for you in California, but when we look at correction officer to prisoner, it's like 1 to 2, right? And so I want those numbers flipped. Why do we care so much, right, about reinvestment and, we're doing it because we want them to be better? No, you don't. If you wanted us to be better, you would have put the money into our damn community earlier before we came in touch with the carceral facility. And we need leaders that are bold enough to say that out loud. And we have to have faith as leaders when we say it, that there are enough people that believe it, that we're going to get reelected again, even though we're honest and truthful. And we're not toning down what we know to be true just because we're in elected positions.
I love that. And I do want to also focus on the importance of elections here, right? Historically, we have not seen prosecutors think like this, prosecutors being leaders in the movement toward reform and just smart justice. And so I do want to make sure I thank each and every one of you for all of the things that you have done in your roles, because it really is inspiring. One of the things I also want to talk about is the need to focus on creating new relief and release mechanisms for people in prison. We talk right now, we're talking a lot about resources and, our budgets, and we don't have the money to fill these gaps like you're talking about and the resources our communities need. But we also know we have far too many people who are in prison who are old and sick and just simply don't need to be there anymore. So I'd love to hear your responses and what you would think legislatively might make the biggest difference if we could, try to push something through our legislatures and our different commonwealths and states. What would make the biggest difference, you think, on long-term resources, but also on reinvesting in Black communities through justice reform? Anyone can.
Yeah, let me jump in because California actually has a great new law that does a lot of what you're talking about. It's a provision called Penal Code Section 1170D. And what it allows us to do, it gives prosecutors the power, either on their own motion or at the recommendation of someone in the community, or often at the recommendation of the state prison system, to identify incarcerated people who are safe to come home, who have served enough time, who maybe wouldn't have received the sentence they received under today's sentencing guidelines or today's standards, and who have strong reentry plans and communities eagerly awaiting their return. In the year since I took office, we've successfully resentenced about 40 people and brought them home from state prison. And one of the things that's really important to remember is that even according to the Department of Corrections' own data, the vast majority of long-term incarcerated people present a very, very low rate of recidivism, very low risk. They're deemed to be low risk by the Department of Corrections. And many of them, give you an example of a woman we resentenced recently, she was 85 years old and had been in prison since I was in diapers. That's an example of someone who does not present a threat to public safety, who has been severely punished for her role in a very serious crime. And when we look at those cases and we see that they have a safe reentry plan, we ask the court to consider resentencing under today's standards, today's sentencing provisions, and allow people to come home to their communities.
I can jump in, right? So, I think, life without the possibility of parole, I'm not a death penalty state. Massachusetts, not through our legislature, but actually through our Supreme Judicial Court, found the death penalty unconstitutional, and we don't have it here any longer. But I believe, Chase is talking about people age out of behavior, right? We are looking at right now many different things, right? Considering life without the possibility of parole, that everyone should be parole eligible. It's an independent board of individuals that they might never let you out, but every 5 or so years, maybe even less than that, you get an opportunity to present. We're thinking about 2-tier sentencing, raising the age of what's a juvenile. I think personally, I've been really disappointed in our state and our governor, candidly, about medical parole. I've seen at least 60 of these requests come in where individuals are elderly and infirmed, right? And denied summarily to the tunes of in the high 90 percentile, these medical paroles are denied. And we know these individuals aren't getting the health treatment that they deserve and I believe are entitled to, right? And then we have done we are not Larry, but we have done tremendous work, and Larry has really been leading the nation in this with our Integrity Review Bureau work, right? And looking backwards to make sure we got it right. We are forward facing, I'm trying to be much more proactive than being reactive. But this is a reactive role as somebody that has come from the U.S. Attorney's Office, where a lot of their prosecutions are proactive, as opposed to we get what the police arrest and bring to us sometimes. But we've undone over close to 240 years of wrongful convictions just in the last year. Right. And so we have to be able to look backwards and say, even though we need bold governors that are going to look at clemency and make big determinations, not just in a global pandemic, but because it's the right thing to do. And we have to push really hard to do that. But so those are some of the ways I think we have leaders on this call that are already doing it. And Larry, will you just tell us all the great things you're doing with conviction integrity and how many years you've undone, how many exonerees you have that you've brought home?
Sure. I mean, and by the way, a lot of other people in the country doing great work in this regard. We have 17 people out for 18 different cases. We have a unit that used to be 1.5 people. When we got here, only half of them were actually interested in finding innocent people or finding people whose trials had been twisted up. We now have about 10 people working full time with some great leadership, and we're proud of that. Let me say this on the question that was asked earlier, though, which I think is closely related. I'm a big fan of things that are self-executing. In other words, it is really hard to go back in time and fix things. And the bigger successes we've been able to have are moving forward into the future. So one of the things that Rachel said, which I think is right there, is, you know, if you look at Germany, there's a place where no matter what you've been convicted of, you are considered for parole at 15 years. There are states where you could pass laws that basically say everybody who's convicted of a felony will be considered for parole at 5 years, and then 5 years later, and then, 5 years later, or maybe at some other interval. Those are the kinds of laws that admit the truth. And the truth is that mandatory minimums never made sense because they pretend to be able to predict the future. And sentencing someone to a whole lot of time in jail right now doesn't make any sense because it pretends to predict the future in ways we cannot know. If you have it so that it's not sort of a one-by-one individual petition process, those are great, but they just don't deliver a lot of numbers. But if you have it so that everyone who gets a life sentence will be considered for parole at 15 years, everyone who gets a sentence of more than 5 years will be considered for parole at 2.5. And there will be a repetitive cycle. Yes, Charles Manson's going to die in jail. And no offense, y'all, but that's okay with me, right? But if everyone is considered for parole, we'll know how to separate Charles Manson from the people who profoundly change and become mentors for the young guys coming in who are just their younger selves, right? We'll know that difference. So I'm a big fan, especially when you're dealing with a scenario where people ain't making a whole lot of money. I'm a big fan of things that are self-executing. So there will be an automatic process requiring reconsideration at an appropriate time, so that we don't just pretend we can predict the future.
And it's important, though, that whoever's on our parole board, the whole system is, where this is a TV family show, so I can't say the word I want to, bluffed up, right? So for me, we got to recognize in Massachusetts, we have 80 Superior Court judges. 3 of them are Black. 3 total are Black, right? Our parole board, what does our parole board look like? Do we have somebody on our parole board who's a returning citizen or who has touched the criminal legal system? Do we have criminal defense attorneys and not only prosecutors? Do we have advocates and adjutants and, community organizers? We need governors, no matter what side you are on, that recognize that we need people with lived experiences making these decisions. Yes, we also need psychiatrists and psychologists, and we need prosecutors occasionally, but we can't be dominating every single thing that we do, right? And then I did see, I know it's a little schizophrenic, but I did see somebody ask a question about immigration. And one of the things I'm very, very proud of is in Massachusetts, we filed the first preliminary injunction against ICE well over about 1.5 years, almost 2 years ago. And I was very proud to stand firm and say, ICE, you are no longer allowed to come in and make federal, civil, administrative arrests around our courthouses, our state courthouses, and deport people. What they were doing was sort of peeking into our databases of our local and sometimes state law enforcement entities to see when Rachel Rollins might be coming into court for something else. And then they would wait till I went through the metal detectors, drag me, literally screaming, out of the courthouse, completely terrifying everyone that's there. And then I'd never be seen again. Because remember, this is your constitutional protections don't apply to civil administrative arrests. They don't have to bring you before an Article 3 judge or a magistrate to explain what it is they're doing. You're just flung in a van and nobody knows where you're going from that point forward. So we filed a preliminary injunction and we won. But we won the battle, not the war. The First Circuit overturned it, but because we were bold, it was within 30 days of the Biden-Harris administration taking office, and we were able to completely enjoin the federal government from behaving this way. And now we're hopeful that ICE is going to change their policies anyways. But, you know, Larry, I know Philadelphia, didn't you guys do something about not allowing ICE into your databases as well?
Yeah, we shut down a contract that gave ICE access after a decade.
Yeah.
And we have a similar policy here in San Francisco. We don't cooperate at the local level with ICE. We want every single person in our community who is a victim of crime to know that if they cooperate with law enforcement, if they come forward to testify or to help us bring justice in a case where they've been harmed, neither they nor the person we're prosecuting will be handed over to ICE by any local authority. We will, and we're actually bound by state law in California as prosecutors to consider immigration consequences, if any, of a criminal conviction when we're negotiating plea deals. And that's something that my office takes very, very seriously. We believe that, I mean, in order to build safety and trust, we have to make sure we're treating people equally first and foremost. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, and just I think for us with UNT visas, we're working really hard to make sure we are educating our staff about that and the sort of cultural competency and working with community partners. But, you know, that is something we don't have as great protection as California might or laws that say that, but we're implementing that through our policies as well.
Well, I know we're at time, but I want to respect your times. I know you're all so busy, but I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I know taking an hour out of your day was probably difficult, but this is such an important topic. I want to thank everybody who was watching tonight. You know, this afternoon, tonight, where I know we're in a couple different time zones, but really, please consider making sure that you understand what the role of a prosecutor is, your local prosecutor is. Try to make sure you get involved in local elections because we need more people who think this way in office. You know, prosecutors do not need to focus solely on carceral responses to harm being caused to our communities because it hasn't worked so far. And we need to be able to reimagine what we do in our future. So again, thank you to each district attorney for taking the time today and for all of the work that you have done to improve our communities across the country. And please continue to lead and be bold in these spaces. Thank you so much, Black Citizen, for putting this on. I think this is a very important topic, and I'm sure you're going to do some incredible work in your community as well. And just one more thing, thank you to FAM. Please text FAM to 21333 to get involved in the work FAM is doing all across the country. They're doing some incredible, incredible stuff. Again, let's try to make sure that we try to focus on keeping our families whole and responses that will really try to heal our communities and not just focus on incarceration. So thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of your day. And everybody else, have a blessed day.
Thank you, Celeste. Great job.
Thank you.